Hello everybody, welcome to the Corporate Performance Delivering Scrutiny Group. Attendance and apologies, item 1. We've got apologies from Chief Superintendent Lisa Winwood, Glyn Payne and Rosie Holmes. Anybody, anything else? Nope. Minutes of the previous meeting. Does anybody, if I just go through them for accuracy, and we'll pick up any actions arising in the action log afterwards. So anybody got anything on page 2? Because they essentially start on there. Nope. No. Page 3. Page 4. Page 5. Oh, okay, so if we start with the actions then that finish on page 5. Will, do you want to give a quick update on?
Yes, so the first action is one for me, which is the Safety Camera Van Annual Report. It has taken its time, I'm afraid, but I'm happy to say, in the sort of factual accuracy stage. So it's with the Traffic Bureau at the moment, who are the road safety specialists in North Yorkshire. They're checking all the facts and figures, and then with a fair wind, we should be publishing by the end of the month, I hope.
Thank you. Items 112 and 114 are closed, so 115, Paul, I think...
That's been done, Chair,
yeah,
yes, it's circulated already.
Closed, yeah. Okay, all right. Okay. The forward planner then, number 3, item 3. Does anybody... I think that looks fairly straightforward. Nobody wants to make any amendments to that? No. Okay. Item 4, questions from the public. And I believe we have one question from Mr. Wilby. Another court hearing yesterday in £1 million civil claim. You are funding. Why no press statement from Julia Mulligan? Paul, do you want to answer that?
Chair, I can comment briefly that is subject to the ongoing court case, and as such it's inappropriate to make any comment on that case here.
Yeah, and actually it is operational in nature, so it wouldn't be me who would be making any press statements about an item like that in any event. Okay, thank you. Okay, with no more questions?
No.
Nope. Okay. All right. Inspection activity. Joanna, you're leading on this rather complicated picture of inspection activities.
Indeed. I mean, this is just for showing for completeness. This includes the HMIC, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary Inspections, which are undertaken by a national body across all forces. Some of them are thematic and some of them cut across the organisation. So they will look at the recent ones we've had for efficiency, for example, and leadership. We've also got within here the internal audit areas of activity. And this is for your scrutiny and for the chiefs. This is taken to the corporate risk group on a monthly basis so that we can track through where we're at, where we're progressing with actions, and all of the actions that we would get through are risk assessed to make sure that they are linking in with the priority areas within the organisation. As you will see, it's rather a comprehensive set of external inspection. There are going to be more joint inspections between various different bodies, I think including Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, inspectorates that work with Ministry of Justice and Prison Services in the future. So those come through, and we also have joint inspections with Social Services Inspectorate and Ofsted, for example. What we're doing, the DCC and myself as joint chairs, is going through all of the risks on the risk register and mapping them against the inspection activity as well, to make sure that the priority focus from a performance perspective is targeted at those areas of main risk, and also where at all possible we're taking the appropriate action for North Yorkshire And by that I mean some of these are national recommendations which might have more direct impact on certain areas of the country than our associated risks. So from an operational perspective, but they are all worked through, and yourself, Commissioner, you put a public response back to all external HMIC inspections, and we also publish all of the internal audit reports as well.
Okay, so it might be worth I think, obviously there's internal inspections and external inspections. This might look a little bit complicated, so I'm wondering whether it might be worth just explaining the structure of how this all works.
I will do my best. Yes, indeed. The national body for inspecting police operational activities is HMIC, which is Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Policing, and all of their inspections are mapped as far as we know them. Some of them are unannounced, including custody inspections, and another one that's actually been suggested as an unannounced visit. They will come in, they will send in a peer group team, and also people who are permanently within that inspectorate and look across the whole of the organisation in turn. Some of them are specific areas of activity, i.e. vulnerability, and some of them, as I said, are about the efficiency and effectiveness of the organisation. They will provide a formal report back, both for ourselves and a national basis. And increasingly, there is an approach which gives timeframes for completing activities, and that's something that the Deputy and I, working to the Chief, have looked at in terms of the appropriateness and the ability to actually undertake the full range of activities that they might be suggesting, which invariably include increasing in training and often an increase in resourcing. That is all worked through against the priorities from an operational perspective and against the police and crime plan, because what we've said all along is that we don't want to just be responding to what's being told us externally from a national perspective, but link it back to what's locally been flagged up as a risk or a priority. In addition to those inspections, there is a formal external audit, and the external auditors are appointed to us historically, nationally. We'll need to appoint our own in the future. They are independent of us, and they are provided by an external company at the moment. They inspect and audit our accounts, for example, and also provide a value for money assessment on an annual basis. So they'll scrutinise not just the financials, but how you're delivering services and how effective you're being. In addition to that, you've got internal audit, which is a strange being in the fact that it's actually independent as well, even though it's internal. And that is provided by an external company, and they will put together a programme of activities throughout the year. And what we've tried to ensure is that we create some capacity within their resource to be able to respond to emerging issues that the risk group are flagging up. So rather than it be just a retrospective reporting process, all parts of the organisation are able to say, is it possible that we can commission a review or an internal audit into various different pieces of work? Those are the main ones, apart from the joint inspections that come through.
Okay, thank you. And so this report basically tries to bring all of those things together and look at how we marry that with the risk and the work that we need to do.
And also manage it on a corporate basis, because at any one point in time there can be a number of people from different organisations and agencies within North Yorkshire Police and Europe and the commissioning activities, and often they are wanting to actually be engaging with the same members of staff or officers, and we certainly find that from the vulnerability perspective. We have compact and very focused teams who are spending quite a lot of time with the inspectorates over the piece of time, so this is to try and assist them with that process as well from an operational perspective.
Just to contextualise it as well, because it appears that there's not a week that goes by that we're not being inspected by somebody, and we obviously as an organisation have to respond to that. But I suppose to put it in one context, we know in the child sexual exploitation, child abuse arena, we've had somewhere in the region of 200 recommendations in the last 6 to 12 months, and how the organisation prioritise those and make sure we deliver against what's been found. But what I think it's not a complete picture, and it's difficult to present the complete picture in a diary form, because we also have 2 national public inquiries that are ongoing. One, which is the Goddard inquiry into child sexual exploitation, which again we need to respond to and as an organisation prepare for. There's the Pitchford inquiry, which is an undercover policing one, which again has a bearing on some of the stuff we do. And then there's a whole plethora of other people, the Office of Surveillance Commissioner, Ofsted, from a multi-agency point of view, Quality Care Commission. So there is an awful lot of stuff that gets funneled into the corporate risk group for us to try and make sense and a debate and discussion around kind of the things that we want to prioritise.
It does really suggest that what we are planning to do is the right thing, which is trying to integrate services at the local level, because a lot of the critical inspections, as the Chief was just talking about, are integrated inspections, now, which is right. They shouldn't be. Any agency who's got a responsibility for protecting children shouldn't be seen purely in isolation. And I think the same's happened in criminal justice. We've seen some more joined up criminal justice inspections, and again, it's the sum total of what we're able to do as a number of agencies that really counts, as opposed to us looking over our shoulder and trying to blame somebody else. If we're all in it together, then it should be a joint integrated inspection programme.
From an operation perspective, that the demand from the inspection regime and demand from the historical inquiries that the Chief's touched upon does have a real tangible effect on day-to-day operational policing. It's constantly sucking attention and resources to meet those needs of both inspection activity and historical public inquiries.
So the other thing also, though, is that there's a difference between historical public inquiries and historical investigations, because historical investigations could have perpetrators who still have contact with potential victims. So there's a difference between the two, and I think that needs to be explained. Yeah.
But I'm also seeing a significant increase in the number of historical reports as well.
Yes.
So our investigations into historical offences that took place more than a year after or a year before they were reported, that's increasing. That is creating demand.
So so with the Goddard inquiry, clearly that looks at the whole issue of child sexual exploitation. How does that link with your work on a day-to-day basis then? Because presumably that inquiry could throw up things that then need to be looked at.
It does, but both those public inquiries create demand. So the Goddard inquiry assess out a number of specific areas that they're looking at. So we're reviewing those areas. For example, the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, and residential schools. So we're reviewing what safeguarding issues we've got for all institutions, which have been touched upon by the Goddard inquiry. In relation to the Pitchford inquiry into undercover policing, we've just had now a second request to produce a Section 9 statement, and I'm providing that on behalf of the Chief Constable in terms of North Yorkshire Police's past approach to undercover policing. So that's what I mean by the demand that's been created by those public inquiries.
And just to be clear, that isn't just specific to North Yorkshire Police, that's for every police service in the country that's been asked for that second statement. And I suppose the other thing I just wanted to throw in, which is this is the kind of the inspection regime, and then what I call the consultation regime, which is we get an inordinate amount of consultations from all aspects, be it prison reform through to, which is the Howard League, they've sent stuff, we've got governmental consultation, which again has to be resourced in order to make sure that we can influence what's happening to the service going forward.
Is there anything, I mean, there have been some quite high-profile inspections, particularly around vulnerability. Is there anything that's coming up in this programme that will need more resources than normal, quote unquote, given that there's a lot of normal?
Well, I think the main ones is I think the Pean inspection, the overarching report into the service is due out in February, I think, which will make various kind of comments, largely positive from what we understand in relation to the general performance of the organisation. But certainly in the area of vulnerability, we know we're likely to get requires improvement, and that is largely the same position for all other forces in England and Wales. So there is something there about making sure that we can identify what is the right level of resourcing for that particular area to deliver what we're being asked on behalf of the public.
Yeah, okay. And that links in with the police and crime plan, which has as its number one priority vulnerability.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Right, so there's a lot of it, but it's all linked. Okay. Okay, so Ken, the next item is yours.
It's mine, Commissioner, thank you. So I just want to start off with the context. In for the purpose of this as a presentation, and the context is around the presentation being an outcomes review of everything to do with people, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail. So for everybody here as a reminder, and for the public, the Commissioner and the Chief Constable have tasked us as a group with moving the organisation away from an outputs-driven organisation to an outcomes-focused organisation. And practically what that means is we used to have targets previously in how fast we attended to an incident, let's say for as soon as practical, which is give us an hour target, and didn't take cognizance of the needs of that victim or what we did once we got there. And what we've tried to do is move the organisation to more of a position where we're more interested in attending at a time that's suitable for that victim and appropriate for the offence, and also on understanding, did we provide a great service when we got there, and we feel that's far better, and that's what you've challenged us to do. So one of the areas you've asked us to look at for outcomes is around people, and that's our results with people both internally within the organisation and externally to the people who receive our service. Simon, you've got the clicker for the next slide. Thanks, Simon. So the focus of the presentation is on people outcomes. So there are 7 work streams within the police and crime plan. Each of those work streams, so each of the things that people around this table are working on, is reporting as part of that work on the people outcomes that they're trying to achieve within those developments within the police and crime plan. And so this presentation is based on me looking through all the things that people around the room have said they would achieve, and then collecting them together under an overall framework of the people outcomes, both internally and externally. And there's 3 strategic people outcomes that we're looking to achieve, and those are on screen, and I'll repeat them for if people don't have access to viewing the screen. And the first one is communities are safer due to effective use of policing resources to reflect need. Secondly, the communities are safer by having a productive policing workforce. And thirdly, the communities feel safer by having an accessible and engaged policing workforce. And the 3 slides that follow are based around those 3 areas. So, the first of those outcomes. So, communities are safer due to an effective use of policing resources to reflect needs. And here's some of the activity that's been undertaken by each of the work streams to achieve that outcome. So, we've established under Paul's leadership a new vulnerable, exploited, missing and trafficked team, what we call a VEMP team, to strengthen our focus on tackling vulnerability. And we've just heard about the particular pressures around vulnerability that the organisation faces, and the task that we're trying to deliver against, which is improving our responsiveness to those who are most vulnerable and to provide better outcomes for them as a service. And there's a whole series of activity, one of which we've taken is the introduction of the new VEMP process. We've got an increased focus on developing intelligence with a particular emphasis on trying to develop predictive analysis. So this is, my term for this is weather forecasting. This is trying to identify where crimes may occur and then intervening before those crimes occur. It's a central element to our preventative strategy to first predict where those crimes might happen. And this is an emerging science, and we're trying to be at the forefront of this emerging science, happening quite effectively in other parts of the world, America mostly. And we're trying to learn from best practice and apply that to the streets of North Yorkshire. Third area is we've invested in quite a significant investment in technology and processes that support the investment in technology through the mobile asset utilisation deployment system, MODS. This is black boxes in cars basically, so we can assess both where we should have tasked our resources to on a predictive model. Did they attend and what difference do they make, but also in helping us understand whether our fleet is productive and whether we can make savings through the fleet, which we can then reinvest in either services or staff. We've also put a lot of investment at the front end of our organisation to better understand the vulnerability of callers, so we can properly put the resources linked to the demand from those most vulnerable. We call that our Thrive process. That's threat, harm, risk, investigation, vulnerability and engagement. And that's taken, we think, about 37% of demand outside out of the requirement to deploy a resource, and that demand is actually dealt with by police officers on the phone with the public and can properly reassure the public over the phone. That means we can use that spare time to identify and provide a better service to those most vulnerable, and thereby provide a better outcome for the people who are most vulnerable in our society. We put investment in partnership work, and a lot of investment in partnership working, because we recognise that outcomes for people are not always just criminal justice outcomes or even policing outcomes. But actually, we know that 80% of our demand comes from about 20% of the population. That same 20% are high demand users for education, for social services, for local authorities, for health, etc. And so sometimes by working better together, we can find the best outcome for the individual needs of a person we might be dealing with as either a victim or an offender. And so we've developed both the community safety hubs, which are effective in both York and Scarborough, and we're looking to develop them across the force now. The further development of watch schemes and our citizens in policing programme. We're the first force in the country to have a chief officer, a volunteer chief officer who sits with us as chief officers, and the chief constable, of course, is the national lead for citizens in policing. And for citizens in policing, that is, as the name suggests, citizens who have an interest in policing, not just with a uniform, with our volunteers, but also broader our neighbourhood watch, etc. That we look to deploy and use to improve the way we deliver a service. And also community safety accreditation scheme, which is linked to that. How can we open ourselves up to a broader number of members of the public to come and join us in our fight to make the county safer. We've got quite significant investment in collaborative working arrangements. That's both within Yorkshire and the Humber, with a specific focus for us on Cleveland and Durham, which are similar size forces to us, and then broadly with those 7 forces plus Northumbria to see what we can do more effectively on areas of high specialism but low need, which means we can do that more effectively and use those resources at a time of greatest risk, which further frees up our local resources to deal with local issues that are relevant to local people. We've got about an £800,000 investment in training with a whole range of training. We mentioned the results of HMIC inspections, which increasingly focus on training solutions. We're interested in improving training programmes to improve our file quality, so then when we do make arrests, we get the best possible result for the victim with the best possible investigation. We're focused on making sure our officers and staff understand the specific needs of vulnerable groups. Richard's leading for us some work with our mental health, where we're increasingly looking at training our staff in what to recognise with people who are suffering from a mental health issue, either in the street or that's the result of the cause of their offending, and can identify the most appropriate solutions for them. And we're also interested through our training to try and prevent crime in the first place, and again that's focused on our front line. In truth, training there is always too much training for the time we have available and for the officers we have, so we have to prioritise, and we've chosen as an organisation those 3 strategic areas in which we wish to invest. We've developed and are continuing to develop a welfare programme to protect the officers and staff who are dealing with some of the most significant issues. So that could be our major collision investigation team and the welfare support to some of our officers who are continually going to either fatal or serious road traffic collisions, to make sure that they remain well and fit and capable to perform in their role. And also those units that are dealing with child sexual exploitation. A lot of that is about viewing images of the most horrendous things that you wouldn't want anybody to have to see, and we want to make sure that those officers and staff remain well and then can perform well in those roles. So we're investing in the welfare programme. We have a seat on the as a national lead for developing the productivity and demand So we want to try and better understand the productivity, the entirety of resources, and also our demand. We've done quite a lot of work on that already, but this again is quite a young science in policing, and so we're trying to improve our knowledge and understanding of that. And so we've got somebody who represents us on the national programmes on productivity and demand, and that enables us to get that best practice and learning at the earliest possible stage. We're developing an agile working programme to encourage a motivated, high-performing and empowered workforce. Gives people the opportunity to work in different environments, and we know about the research that says that people who have the opportunity to work in those can be far more productive, and hence why we'd like to invest in the agile programme. And we're also developing a new skills framework to understand role by role what skills each people need within the organisation, and make sure they have the access to training and development in order to perform that role. So perhaps that's a good time just to pause on this one before I move on the other two and see if there's any questions on this area.
Well, I've got a question. Thank you, Ken. That's very comprehensive. I think what might be helpful, because the people outcomes are related both to internal and external, yes, is to split what we're doing around internal work and around what we're doing externally to try and sort of clarify this.
Yeah.
I suppose what I'm trying to get a sense of is around resources. What are the real challenges that we've got at the moment? And then secondly, there's a few sort of specifics in here. So in particular, the VEMT team. How do we know that that's going, if it's effective or not? So is it we know what it's been set out to do, but how will we know whether it's effective? And then I think, and this is for another meeting, I would like to see, and I think it's planned, Paul, but correct me if I'm wrong, an assessment of Thrive and how that is working, not just in relation to it as a sort of a tool, a response management tool, but so when a call comes into the control room, the Thrive process is instigated, but also how it works, for example, around victims and in particular vulnerability, and whether or not it is sufficiently developed to look at some of the wider applications that it has potential for. So at the moment, I think it's working in the force control room predominantly, but I think there are other applications where it might where it's still embryonic.
Shall I comment on that?
Yeah,
on that now?
yeah.
Thrive has been back here, hasn't it? But it was launched in April 2014. And it came back here 12 months later with an evaluation report on it. It's now constantly subject to continuous improvement. It is embedded in the force control room, but in terms of your point, is it just the force control room? I would argue it's gone far more than that, because it is now used as a term to support our decision making. And the term is often used as an incident has been thrived. It's not just.
You see, I would challenge that, because I spent some time with the victims team in York, and some of the difficulties that they had was around the richness of the information, if you like, that Thrive process generated, and it not being passed on, if you like, or reliable enough. Would that be a good way of putting it?
Yeah.
To be used by that victims team, and so what I think is interesting with Thrive, because I think it's got a lot of potential. I think it works well in the force control room, but I'm not sure it's sort of spread its wings as effectively as it might have done.
I don't think we've maximised the potential that it has in terms of supporting victims after crime, and there's more that we can do around that, particularly the transfer of information that's held within the force control room and on niche to the supporting victims team. We've not quite got that right yet, so we need to get better at that.
I mean, and certainly people have said to me that they're not certain that it's that effective in a rural situation as well, that some of the different circumstances that people find themselves in, that it's quite a narrow assessment in relation to a call that comes in, as opposed to something that is broader and could be used more widely. I think it's got lots of potential, but I'd like to sort of see how that is actually panning out in practice.
It's an approach that we employ for decision making, primarily in the force control room. It has been assessed by HMIC and compared to other forces, and the commentary come back from HMIC is that we've applied it well. It has got an engagement element onto it in terms of dealing with the victim's needs and understanding vulnerability. That's a key part of Thrive. But then there's far more to victim support and victim services that lie behind that. And I don't know whether I'm perhaps misunderstanding the point, but Thrive's responsibility is not so much victim services. This is a decision-making tool, but the support services that come after that are fundamental as well. So it depends what we mean about is Thrive doing what it's supposed to do.
Well, this is what I'm trying, because I think it might be being billed to do more than it is actually doing, and so I want to understand where it's working well, where people are saying it should be working and actually it's still in its early stages, and actually where it might go in the future. And I think it's clearly quite effective in terms of the force control room and some of the things you talked about there. And therefore, what are the dependencies around that? So, for example, the victims' team are having to ask victims to repeat their stories to get more information out of it. And are there opportunities early on in that process to reduce those type of circumstances? Things like that.
Okay.
Can I just ask? We've no green lights on at this end. Are we working?
Yes, sounds fine, but if the mic button. Yeah.
We are having a few buffering issues with the video, but whatever problems we have, we can sort out.
Okay.
I mean, I think just going on that point, I think in effect what we're talking about is a triage process. So I think one of the gaps that we have is that the triage process is only as good as the patient information that you get. And I think one of the vulnerabilities that we face in sort of rural communities is where people may have been the victims of crime in the past but haven't come to the police. Our assessment then doesn't allow for that vulnerability to be assessed at the right level. And I definitely think the College of Policing have picked up on this as well. I think they're going to do an assessment of Thrive because it's seen as the kind of triage of choice at the moment. But it does need to be built upon, and it's only as good as your kind of customer relationship software, isn't it? Which is, Dave Jones may have rung once, but may have been a victim many, many times, but we don't know that in our system. And it's how we get that level of that sort of richer picture that we need to sort of go for, isn't it?
Yeah, it's still flashing. Okay, so I also think though, if you think about rural examples again, and there'll be many other examples in many other circumstances, but the impact of people being isolated. For example, if they're calling from a situation where there might be something threatening going on late at night in an isolated rural area, is the fear that generates being sufficiently thought about in that Thrive process, or is it in terms of the response that is being deployed? So it's looking at the sort of wider context of the person who is calling and making sure that all of those circumstances are taken into consideration, rather than the sort of immediate assessment that you would do to determine a response, if you see what I mean. And it's those type of things that I think would be quite interesting to look at.
And I certainly won't defend Thrive to say we get it right all the time. Far from it. We know there are times when Thrive can be applied properly, and understanding vulnerability, understanding the needs and expectations of the caller, the victims are really important. But the vulnerability side of it very much depends upon the bespoke situation of that person that's calling, whether it's rurality or any other reason. But
I think the advantage is that it's not as if we haven't got the data. We've got the tape-recorded conversation to begin with, so it's not as if, and then the follow-up. So it feels as if at least the basic data's there to start having a look at it.
So I wonder whether then, if we could track a few through the system, couldn't we? So from the call through to what happens to them, how the response is dealt with, and then the referring to the victims team, how they then are dealt with in the victims team, what the victims team has to do in order to deal effectively with that individual, and to try and sort of look at a few sort of case histories to see how that's working, and try and find a number of different scenarios rather than just dip sampling, if you see what I mean. We could actually say, okay, well, we've got a range of different scenarios we want to test, and can we look at how they're handled? I don't know.
So do we want to, maybe between Paul and Jenny, to just think about what that might look like in the future.
Happy to take an action with Jenny. We can work our terms of reference out, can't we, and commission that piece of work.
And it also links into the work through the local criminal justice board and the victims and witnesses board, and that tracking of that journey that those people take, particularly around vulnerability, and how we make sure that all of the different parts of the system, quote unquote, actually work together.
Yeah, well, we can build that in as part of the overall tracking.
Yeah, okay.
Just in terms of what we're trying to achieve with Thrive from this particular presentational topic around, this is around effectiveness as an outcome, and this is exactly the example I gave. So if prior to us implementing this and prior to us focusing on outcomes, if you were reporting a burglary, for example, then our assessment would be we will send somebody to you wherever we can within an hour, and our target was 95% of response within an hour, and that did not take account of the fact that you're an elderly person in an isolated rural location that probably needs to be there much sooner than an hour, or it's a burglary of your shed in the town centre and you don't require, and you're not available for the next 3 hours, and so that, which would be considered a fail. So the idea is, the whole point around the Thrive process is try to understand the very specific needs of the specific victim and then gear the response appropriate to the specific needs of that individual. And they've all been, I'm not saying we're getting it right every time, but the purpose of the Thrive process is exactly as you're suggesting, and if we track it we'll be able to find that. But that's an example of where we shifted from something we had to this process, and can demonstrate some really good movement that would benefit from more qualitative data. I accept that, but that is an example of why we introduced it in the first place.
I think Thrive is an ongoing process as well, isn't it?
Yeah,
it needs to
that's
change.
Yeah, exactly.
I think there is something around educating certain teams within the organisation. So, for example, our witness care unit have had a Thrive input, so they can sort of be aware of actually what that initial response is and how that might be able to be applied later on down the line. So I think that, it's a continual assessment process.
But it's quite right that the intent is then measured against the reality and see how close we're not, and it's an evolving kind of process as we get more sophisticated with the level of data that we can sort of research. Isn't it?
I don't think we should assume, because where people come from, they will be more vulnerable or otherwise.
Exactly.
Because it is down to the individual, isn't it? I mean, isolation can sometimes cause vulnerability, but in their eyes, because being a victim of a very isolated location, they might not be. But I think from an experienced dispatcher's point of view, they would look at that, see it on mapping and see it isolated, pardon me, and consider those options. Because if they consider those, they're at least thinking about the vulnerability. Could you just come on to the point below, Commissioner, in terms of investment in partnership working, or have you finished on Thrive?
No, that's fine.
Just in terms of, I think it's important we understand that what we're trying to do with integration with our partners is work on integrated hubs. And we've started in the urban centres, but now we're starting to spread that out into more rural centres as well. It poses a different set of challenges, but we've just seen one of the first updates from Hamilton and Richmondshire, their plan going forward into this year, and it's quite interesting to see that. I mean, I think there's quite a bit of work done nationally on urban integrated hubs. There's less being done on rural integrated hubs. So I think what we'd expect to see is we know what the outcome we're after, but I think it challenges us in a different way to think about how we reach that outcome in the Rydales, the Cravens and Hamilton Richmonds. So that piece of work's ongoing, and I suspect it'll roll out for the rest of the year, and we'll learn as we go through that.
The other thing just to mention again, as a deliverable since the last meeting, we've obviously signed off the Community Safety Accreditation Scheme at the York Community Safety Hub. So there's about a dozen people now who are actually hoping to protect their communities, whereas previously we've not, and that's down to sort of the team that's been working in the partnership with the local authority. So again, that wider kind of law enforcement network has been enhanced in the 6 weeks since we last met.
And we're talking to another local authority at the moment about the potentials as well, so it's not just one local authority.
I think at some point also it'd be given sort of the sort of future direction of travel, it might be linking in with the conversations we had around EB, is looking at the pressures around training. So we've just heard a lot about the HMIC and them always recommending that more training is needed. And in addition to that, we've also identified ourselves that more training is needed in certain areas. So I just wonder as well at some point in the future whether we need to bring back a more detailed look at actually how the organisation's training function is working and delivering.
I think that's fair. I think only in the last year or so we actually got a costed training programme, which we didn't have previously, so there's been a lot of work in relation to that. I think, as Ken alluded to, the demand outstrips the supply, and it's about how you prioritise all that. And the other thing that I constantly remind my colleagues in the military is that the military are either fighting or training, and we're fighting every day. So if you're going to pull somebody off training, then you're pulling them off the front line. And we need to make sure we have a balance between the level of training and that how it needs to be accredited. So it's not just about, if you turn up you get trained. It shouldn't be that anymore. And also, is it actually training people with the skill set that we need to deliver the threats and the emerging threats that we're facing? And there's been an inordinate amount of training around online in particular across the nation and around vulnerability. What's not followed some of that is, and what's the evaluation? Because the HMIC will make a recommendation about a training programme, but then doesn't really evaluate whether or not that's actually delivering the change that we want to see in people. But yeah, absolutely, I think Ken would welcome that, I think.
Yeah.
Welcome that.
And also how that links in with the skills framework as well, because obviously that assessment will link in with requirements.
Absolutely vital, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think to demonstrate that the link's working between the risk group and this group, we've actually had the discussions around the training for the future and a piece of work I think has already been started by the Director of HR to be able to bring that into this context. So,
John, have you got anything to add in this area?
There's a lot of work being done currently by the College of Policing, which I'm now sitting on the advisory board for, so we're getting quite a lot of upfront feedback on that, which is really, really useful, because it means that we can be ahead of the game if we adopt it. And a lot of the ideas we're currently doing within HR are mirroring everything that's going on there. We're a little bit ahead of the game at the moment because we're going into a process very shortly with the PPF process and the PPI process, and also the PDR process, which is a little bit ahead of the game because the College of Policing isn't quite ready to launch anything yet. So we're going to be up front. So I think we'll probably end up with an interim process of some sort until we have something national that we can adopt right across all police forces in the country.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, the College of Policing has got to deal with some significant budget cuts, and one of my concerns around the college is whether how well resourced it is at the moment. And so I suppose we've got to make an assessment of, do we wait for the college or do we get on with it? And then if there's anything material we need to change, assess that. I don't know whether...
Well, I suppose in part we are trying to get on in Origin. For example, the PDR process for Origin will it'll be there and we'll be running with that irrespective of whether the college are in that position or not.
Yeah.
I've just got a text saying we're having some technical problems about the live streaming at the moment, Commissioner. From just someone who's listening.
Right, okay.
It's published afterwards.
Okay.
Okay, should we?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
If I can just come on that, the PPF that's been referred to, I think that's the Police Professional Framework, which is the mechanism for identifying what skills and experience different roles need, which obviously is then key to actually feeding into that future training requirement. So I think that's a really good development.
Okay, all right.
Okay, Commissioner, you mentioned about what are the resourcing pressures, so I'll cover that off under this slide. So the first outcome was all about effectiveness. The second outcome is all about productivity and how do we understand that our workforce is productive, and then what does that mean in terms of making communities safer. And so this is the work that we're developing in this area. We've already developed and have for a number of years now had a reasonable understanding of demand in certain areas of our workforce. According to HMIC, better than most other forces actually in relation to how we understand demand, and that's subject to an annual refresh. And as we manage our change programs through, increasingly other units are being subject to clear demand requirements, and so that's going to improve over time. There isn't anyone in the country that's doing this really well, and the demands on policing are very quite complex in terms of what an individual officer might choose to do. But we're at the leading edge of that. What the latest demand refresh has told us in terms of pressures is that the volume of reports of historical and live child sexual exploitation investigations and general vulnerability, potentially linked to our improved processes through Thrive or others, or we would hope that a greater confidence of the public to report some of these vulnerability means that goes into a relatively small number of people, and their ability to deal with that needs to be increased, and that was brought to your meeting earlier on, and so we need to invest because of the pressure on the demand in our serious crime teams, who are the people we task to investigate those people who suffer, who are very vulnerable and suffer some horrendous crimes. And there's a clear demonstration of where that excess of demand is going at the moment. Some of it is going into our major crime team, some of it is going to our investigation hubs, and some of it is being dealt with by officers on response or in neighbourhoods. And we want to make sure that demand is being dealt with by those who are trained to deal with that. And so that's the biggest area of pressure for us at the moment in terms of what the demand is telling us. It's also telling us that our major crime team is properly, we've got about the right numbers in our major crime team, and it's telling us we've got slightly too many on our response teams, and we can afford to reduce our response teams slightly. And that's linked into Paul's development of the investigation hubs, which are taking the investigations on from the response function, and also our Thrive function, which is reducing the demand on those officers. So that gives us a pretty reasonably scientific view of the ability to remove officers from that area and put them in other areas, for example in the safeguarding area. I mentioned the creation of the investigation hubs, and the purpose of those investigation hubs is to be built around our custody centres, so that when somebody is arrested, they can be dealt with by officers who are trained to deal with interviewing and file preparation, etc., which gives us the best chance of getting the best justice outcome for the victims and for that specific offender. And that's been work in progress. We spent a lot of time training. There's a good mix of police officers and police staff within those, not exclusively police officers, which I think is good and seems to be going well. We've made a significant investment in the automatic number plate recognition system, both around our fixed sites but our mobile cameras, so we can move our automatic number plate recognition to those areas that are suffering the greatest demand, particularly in those areas that link to our borders, from criminals who choose to travel across the borders to commit crime in this area. And we intend to further invest in supporting that in the work that I'm currently doing on this specialist operations to maximise our investment in the ANPR. Paul's the national lead for ANPR, and so we want to make sure we have national best practice in our force. An improved partnership working using information sharing, so we obviously have to properly protect information that we hold as an agency, and properly where appropriate share that information with other agencies that we work with to find the best outcomes for people, and our legal services department do support us quite heavily in relation to doing that, and we've got a range of partnership working that Richard or the deputy could cover off in more detail if you want it. We mentioned the skills matrix. You made the point, Commissioner, quite rightly about the link to training. The identification through every role in organisation is what skills do they need, and then an assessment of what skills they currently have will give us the gap that informs the training. And that's the basic training, what we call just the rhythm of training during the course of the year. Each year as people, we can anticipate people coming and going, which links into succession planning. We now have a really good succession planning document that covers our succession requirements for the next 3 years based on all our years of experience of what we can anticipate, and that informs our promotion and selection policies going forward. And then finally, we've to make sure we have a productive workforce, the research tells us that if you want a productive workforce, you need to have an effective wellbeing programme in place, and we've developed a wellbeing programme and are currently in the process of training all our leaders in 2 areas. One is to understand and recognise where people are falling over, and then to find the right interventions for people who are themselves not feeling well. The second thing I forget, it'll come back to me. I was thinking about the understanding yourself as a leader. So we're putting people through both 360 and Myers-Briggs type indicator training, and the whole purpose of that is to understand why you respond in certain ways to certain situations, and how that impacts on others. So that's in terms of productivity. So any questions on productivity?
I'd just say, in terms of information sharing agreements, we've got more partners signed up to a common information sharing agreement that we've had in for some considerable period of time. That's largely down to a lady called Emma Morris in Legal Services, and we've shared that with forces around the country. The key part of it, information sharing agreement, is the first step. Then successfully sharing that information in a useful way is the next step. And so there are no barriers to it, but I think we've now got to push ahead in the next year to make sure we get access to the right data, which will help us deliver the outcomes. I think for several years we had clear barriers, and so, for example, we have a number of, nearly all the main health agencies are signed up to it. It's getting that data in a useful format that's the big difference.
Yeah, so it's people understanding there are no barriers now.
There are no barriers to that. We will share. We will, and it's up to us as well. It's sharing out from the police, but it's also sharing inwards and for the appropriate purposes. And I think some people fear we might want it for inappropriate purposes. No, we're there to try and deliver what it says in the policing plan. Actually, reduce victimisation, protect people from becoming further victims of crime. They're our priority areas. So it's just paying credit.
I mean, obviously, it also will depend on because the information sharing agreement covers a number of different organisations. Some will be more effective than others, and indeed, different parts of the one organisation might be more effective than another part of the one organisation. It's identifying those sticking points.
Which cultures and subcultures within organisations, you might get a chief executive sign up to it and then find one department almost point blank refuses to. But we can only tackle those when we come across them.
I mean, the only thing for me is that there's an awful lot of work internally, but also nationally around demand. I think where there's a real gap is supply. So how many forces really do understand what their staff actually spend their time doing, and against what priorities? So that's where the sort of the black box in the vehicles helps, because we'll know exactly where our people are being sent and whether or not they're in the right places. But also, once you get to mobile data, it will also tell you what they're spending their time doing as well on an individual basis. So how many times a road policing officer stops a vehicle or fills out a road traffic form, etc., etc. Nationally, we are very poor on that data. It used to be a 15-minute fill a form in, I think I remember what it was called, an ABC, which was activity-based costing. So you can't max your productivity unless you understand your demand and your supply at the same time. And I think that's the supply bit that we really need to work on going forward as well.
Chair, brief comment on ANPR, just very briefly. Last year you commissioned the £1 million investment into cameras, so we've now almost completed a threefold increase in cameras, and anecdotally getting feedback, particularly from the rural communities, that ANPR has proven really successful in terms of tackling travelling criminality. By the end of February we'll complete a review with a rollout of ANPR. That's not just the camera technology, but it's how we use it, how we use intelligence, within the FCR, and that will give us some findings in terms of where we're going next. And in terms of my national role, I've commissioned a capacity and capability inspection of all police forces on their use of ANPR. So we're then ideally placed to cross-reference all the best practice nationally with what we're doing here. And unashamedly, we're saying to the rest of the world that we want to be the centre of excellence for ANPR. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think we will be fairly soon, that we'll be comfortably able to say that we are the best at ANPR. Not only with the number of cameras, but how we employ them and get maximum efficiency and effectiveness out of them.
You only have to look on a nightly basis in terms of road crime teams, for example, and the amount of work they manage to change, because they're ideally placed with the right kit, and it's not just luck that they're doing these things. They've been directed to the right place and tackled. There's some professionalism as well that's going on, but that information wasn't available a couple of years ago. And if you watch them on social media, they do churn out the votes night after night after night.
It's a proven technology and it works.
We have had some questions around some of the sort of sensitive issues around that, Paul, around people's personal data and that side of it. Would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can. It's really complex, and I'm dealing with this on a national basis as well, because the current rules are that we return ANPR data for a maximum of 2 years. we have got potential to preserve it for specific inquiries. And that has been challenged in some quarters, that data retention period is right. I work with the Information Commissioner's Office and the Surveillance Camera Commission on that very issue, and they're supportive of the current approach we've got for data retention. But what we are doing both locally and nationally is trying very hard to be more transparent over how we use ANPR. We never hide the fact that we utilise ANPR cameras. We're not might not be explicit about exactly where they are, because these cameras are often used both for some sensitive investigations around counter-terrorism, serious organised crime, as well as for local policing as well. But despite that, we're working very hard to be transparent. But the data retention period is currently 2 years. That is the real central matter of privacy. But as I say, we are working with the ICO and the Surveillance Camera Commissioner around those issues, and trying to bring better governance in as well, so that we are seen by the public to be transparent how we use ANPR, how we use the data linked to ANPR.
Okay.
Okay, Commissioner, my final slide is, so the first one was about effectiveness, and the second one was about productivity. The final one is about having an accessible and engaged workforce. So, and these are the projects that we're doing in relation to that. So we've mentioned mobile working technology and practices, not just within officers having understanding what officers are doing, but also with the Agile programme and looking at the appropriate use of technology in order to support an Agile programme, increases the engagement of our staff based on the research we've done. It also allows us to look at our estate strategy, so what's the most appropriate, not just estate, but the research you've conducted on how people wish to contact us, which firmly showed they still like to use the phone. So how do we make sure that our estate is at such a point that it enables us to be both accessible but also engaged as an organisation? And the next two items are linked. So firstly, review and agree a cultural change to get it right first time for victims. We know for some time we've had an issue with both investigation quality and file quality, and we've put an awful lot of effort into making sure we get that right. That does involve a cultural change, whereas previously we've had officers who will do an investigation and that will go through somebody who's checking. We can't continue to afford to keep putting in people to check other people's work. And so the cultural change is, let's get it right first time and make sure we're properly training people in doing that, and with a very strong focus on there's victims at the centre of all of this, and not just the criminal justice process. You're doing this for the victims, not to support the criminal justice process. And the second was linked to that, is develop a compliance methodology to measure compliance with the Code of Practice for Victims of Crime. Okay, there is a nationally published and agreed Code of Practice for the victims of crime. We want to make sure that we can actively measure our compliance against achieving that, and there's a lot of work within the organisation. Leanne spent a lot of her time within the organisation at managing that as well. So,
I think it's important to sort of just mention that it's not one measure. You know, there's about 30 different measures within the code itself, but essentially you can break that down into overarching measures around keeping victims informed, making sure they've got the right support for the right people at the right time, and there's a lot of work that we're doing in relation to that. We actually are already measuring a number of areas of those, but some of the further development work is to bring that together and make it a little bit more streamlined, I think.
Streamlined would be good. I mean, I remember when they brought this in, and one of the PCC's concerns nationally was that it was going to create a monster in terms of compliance and demonstrating that we're complying.
Yeah.
So streamlined would be good.
I mean, essentially, you know, this is probably around reality checking and dip sampling and phoning up victims, and we do some of that. We actually have volunteers doing some of that with a certain category of offences. So we've got development plans to potentially expand that. I
mean, the issue here is whether people are getting a good service, not whether they're ticking a box on a code of practice, and that's the bit that we need to measure, not the box ticking.
They're satisfied,
yeah. Hence why this is under the outcome section, as opposed to output section.
Yeah.
So and so obviously there's been a lot of work under the Chief Constable's leading this area, but I'm aware that your office and you have put a lot of effort into improving the results for victims of crime, and use your commissioning powers to make sure that's done. We got really good feedback from Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary on our approach to implementing the Code of Ethics. We've got one of our master's students, High Potential Development Scheme Officer, who's doing his master's dissertation on how we have implemented our Code of Ethics compared to other forces around us, just to see if we can get some learning, and we continue to push the Code of Ethics, but we don't believe our officers act unethically on a day-to-day basis. In fact, there's very, very good evidence that our officers and staff and volunteers actually act and make decisions in a very ethical way all of the time. So, and when they do fall foul, then we'll deal with that. But the evidence suggests that most people are acting in an entirely ethical way. We've developed as part of our technology work, we developed a unified communications project. And what that actually means is it gives greater opportunities for accessibility of people within the organisation to the public and to others.
It's the phone system.
It's the phone system, yeah. Well, I think, but it's more than that.
I know it's more than that, but
it's it supports so that wherever you sit, your phone follows you, rather than if you want to contact the chief constable, you can't wait. He doesn't have to wait until he's in his office. It could be wherever he is. The phone follows him around. So. Poor old chief constable.
So it should make the public have more chance of getting hold of the person they want to speak to. I think that's the problem.
So that brings me on to some of the. So there's obviously been a number of assessments and pieces of research done over the past year or so, and very often that comes out as one of the key issues, and also what we discussed the other day around feedback that people get. Yeah. So when they've given us some intelligence, or they've, reported a crime, what happens, and trying to get people to get more feedback and then close that loop, so people are encouraged to report and encouraged to. I think there's still some work that needs to be done around that, really.
Yeah.
Certainly, there is a lot of work being done under various different programmes and projects. I mean, one of the things that Unified Communications are doing is actually looking at the fact of our direct dial numbers, because we've got lots and lots of direct dial numbers as well as the 101. So it's actually how are we making it easy for people to contact the right person? So that's being looked at across the board, and we're making sure that we bring the findings from the 101 and the work that Force Control Room are doing in assessing alternative ways of dealing with some of the issues that was raised from the 101 review. Ease of access, knowledge about the numbers and various different things, which is a key one, but also bringing it in with this piece of work here to make sure that they're going to be complementary.
I think one of the areas of our community that's really engaged with policing is Neighbourhood Watch, for example. So we are out for tender at the moment for a new system which has built into it that kind of feedback loop, isn't it? And I was in a conversation with the Chief Executive of Crime Stoppers last week. They have the same issue. So again, the service needs to get its act together around how you actually do close that loop, even if the loop's closed in a negative sense, that there's not a lot more we can do. But I think it's just bad manners that you don't go back and actually finish the conversation with the public.
Another element of the Unified Comms has enabled us to bring in video conferencing into the organisation, and that's being used quite extensively now. I used it when I was Gold for the Flooding to talk between the Gold group and the Silver group. That was really effective in actually seeing people. Also, we've got a meeting next week with University over at Scarborough that we're doing by video conference between Scarborough to avoid us having to travel over there or them having to travel into us. So this, the opportunity for savings on a training side gives us the opportunity to do virtual training, a whole different range of things. So it's more, to me, it's more than just a phone system. We're trying to make sure we maximise the investment we put into that. And then a final point for me is around engagement. And so we've developed an engagement plan that enables us to effectively, and the term engagement rather than communications plan is deliberate here. It's face to face across the entire organisation at set times that are already in all of our diaries during the course of the year. So it includes our leadership days with the 70 senior leaders in the organisation quarterly, but also meetings with the superintendents as a specific group, meeting annually with our PCSOs, as a group. So, so it includes our specials, all our volunteers. It includes our PCSOs, police staff, police officers at all levels within the organisation as a planned activity for the entire year, every year. Because the research that we've studied and seen and are convinced by is that to have a really highly motivated, productive workforce, there's two really good things that you need. One is a strong sense of well-being and a strong engagement, so everybody understands where the organisation's going, and that's what we're trying to achieve with this.
So I've got one question, and it's sort of, I'm looking at you, Will. KINS and the community mapping exercise that we were going to do. Clearly we had a little setback in that the student intern that had said she was going to do that project for us is no longer doing it. Have we got? No, we haven't.
Unfortunately not, no. So I've been in touch with the university, so it was a university scheme, so it was a graduation where you sort of put forward a project and recent graduates sort of put their name forward really and undertake that work for you. Unfortunately our graduates had to personal so she's had to pull out, but and the university can't refill that place.
Right.
So if we do want to do it, we either need to do it ourselves or find another way. So we have had interns before help us with things like police complaints and looking at those things. So it's not something we haven't done, but we have to sort of go back to the drawing board really to get that work done, which would be really helpful work.
I mean, we need it, and also the force needs it. So I think we need to regroup on that.
It's all going back to the Chief's point about the sort of neighbourhood watch messaging system, which went to a couple of presentations yesterday actually, and it'll be much wider than that now. It won't just be neighbourhood watch. Someone in the sort of presentations made the point about mapping things like third sector groups. So we've got sort of some sort of vulnerability mapping, or at least if something happens, you can get in touch with the right people. So there is a really it feeds into lots of other work that would be really helpful to do.
I think that reflects as well on the last night in terms of the presentation of the Youth Commission work and listening to them about the importance of communicating with that segment of our population who don't feel we gear much communication their way, and the communication engagement is equal really. Communication, but they talked about engaging and having that importance of both face-to-face engagement and using technology to engage in equal measure, depending on what the issues were. So Commissioner, just one other point. I mean, you mentioned getting it right first time. I think the issue and it says for victims, but actually we can spare victims an awful lot if we get it right to the degree that the offender pleads guilty, because the quality of the evidence presented is so good, and there is such a big drive in relation to criminal justice now. The transforming summary justice and better case management. Ultimately, if a victim doesn't have to go to court to relive their experience, some of them are incredibly traumatic, the quality of that investigation plays a huge part in someone pleading guilty or not. Sometimes the evidence just isn't there, but when it is there, it's our duty to collect it and present it in the right way. And I think that's what, we've put a huge amount of effort and time into that. But one of the things we're trying to do, and as I was talking to a colleague of Leanne's only last week, about assessing the added value that our training and our skilling has done over the last year to making sure the raw product is better when it first reaches your department. And I think that's something we just continue need to work on and assess where we've got to as we go through the next 6, 12, 18 months.
We've designed a range of performance measures in relation to that, and that's being developed and adjusted as we've discussed it and consulted with colleagues across the organisation, and that's actually helping us to give us some evidence base around where we would focus some of our training in terms of that going forward. But as Mr. Madgwick has said, there's been a significant drive from June to October with continued professional development around changing the mindsets in terms of the cultural change here, and we've had a good introduction to that, and we now need to continue that going forward into better case management, which starts actually the first hearing at Crown Court this week in terms of that. So a lot of work around speeding up justice and making sure that we take out those early cases through earlier guilty pleas to allow us to concentrate on those other areas that require more focus, and particularly around vulnerability.
I mean, it's interesting. I was thinking about Keely, our revenge porn victim. Her partner pleaded guilty, and she didn't have to go to court. And she said very clearly, if she'd had to have gone to court, she wouldn't have done. because she didn't want to go through that again.
Yeah.
So that whole process is so important.
I mean, you know, we're starting to see some good results of that, but I think we've now got a sort of a data set that we can look at from the baseline and then build upon, and that's taken a while to get to that point, and I think there'll be more of that around some of the BCM work as well, and so that gives us a rich, better case management, which is similar principles to transform summary justice within the Crown Court.
Yeah.
Can I just mention might have a solution to the problem about your intern? So I was on the phone this morning to York University, one of the professors there, heads at the management school. There's an opportunity arising shortly for 600 hours for master's students to come and work in North Yorkshire Police. I'll discuss it with Mr Mcintosh outside the meeting. But the huge volume of people there that we could utilise on a range of different research projects to complement their master's programmes. So, but it needs discussing at the chief officer level. But it's an opportunity potentially.
I think it's useful to note that actually, and pay credit to Ken, because actually our involvement with the education sector in particular has grown tremendously. I was on the phone to the Vice Chancellor at York University the other day, who was very, very keen to continue to work with us, and I think we're only just scratching the surface with them. And obviously then Coventry and Scarborough, and they were in Askham Bryan, so there's a whole host of educational establishments that we're building really good relationships with. And I think there's an opportunity again to do some really key work that we need to do.
Can I just mention another thing around getting it right first time? And that is around the other cultural change that we've put ourselves in a really strong position around, and that's around the pre-charge bail preparation. The most recent development for that is that there are going to be some Home Office recommendations that are going to go in on the 10th and 11th of February, and that will, we think, result in what we anticipated might be coming before the pilots. And
28 days.
28 days initially, but that goes up through to ACC level after 6 months in terms of granting bail as well now, and then through to the court process. So there are some additional areas that are likely to develop, and that is even with following the pilot results that we're putting in, which we're not sure are going to make a huge difference to the legislation. But what that will do is that will focus minds on the investigative process, and ensure that we're making sure we're getting that right again first time, speeding that up.
We've come a long way, I think, in the last 6 to 12 months on that. So I think the pilot we took part in, and also the investigation hubs where the ethos is getting it right first time down on bail. We have seen a significant reduction in pre-charge bail, and particularly on offences and vulnerability. So, for example, in domestic abuse cases, we've seen a significant reduction in times that bail is being used, which has got to be positive.
Good. And I think the bail process will be used probably for those areas that where safeguarding is required, and I think everything else will probably be through other methodology.
But I think it poses a challenge for our criminal justice partners, because we've still got cases that are listed a long way out, and we have to think about the implications, the risks to the people who are being bailed and re-bailed, because there's some in difficult circumstances in terms of the threats to them as individuals, and then of course primarily to the victims. You have to wait I think in some cases an unrealistically long period of time, especially if they find it stressful from the outset, to wait for 6 to 12 months. It can be life-changing.
Yeah, I think you're right, but I think there will be a cost with this as well, Cross. I mean, I think the courts estimate that there'll be at least £22 million worth of additional costs for hearings of bail that will go to them above 6 months, or 6 to 9 months. There are different staged processes, and so I think that there will be other implications around resources.
But the interesting thing is, we talked before about the inspection regime and the consultation regime. This is the Police and Criminal Justice Bill that's being laid before Parliament on the 10th of February. Yeah. So it's managing that and understanding implications and resourcing issues, because it's not just this area of business. It's about fire and rescue. It's about
police complaints.
Police complaints, new powers
Yeah.
for volunteers and PCSOs.
Yeah.
So again, it's just how we kind of manage that and thinking that through going forward.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at rural centre around November, I think, aren't we? And probably implementation by April 2017.
Yeah.
In terms of bail, there are two factors that really influence the use of bail. One is waiting for CPS decision making, and the other is around digital forensics, which we've discussed in other meetings. But by improving our investment in digital forensics and our ability to examine mobile telephones, iPads and the like, that will speed up and reduce the number of times that we need to bail people. So digital forensics is very much linked to the trying to cut down on bail.
And when you speak to defence lawyers, that's one of their big areas of concern, is around digital forensics and the amount of time it takes.
Interestingly, when a case goes to CPS for advice, the time clock ceases, it pauses. So
they're not subject to the same.
No, it doesn't appear to be.
It might be in the future though, I think.
Maybe, yeah.
But just the sheer growth, I mean, I saw a stat the other day, which is 3 years ago, 40% of the adult population in the United Kingdom had a smartphone. It's now, 3 years later, 70%. So that sheer, kind of every time we arrest anybody now, they have digital devices on them, which puts immense pressure on our processes.
It does. But I think we're quite well ahead of the game, because from inputs at national conferences, there are a number of other forces that have indicated, well, what's all that about then? Because they haven't actually necessarily been, because we put ourselves forward and as a part of the pilot, so I think we're quite well placed, we know what's coming. Yeah.
Okay.
That's it.
Is that it? Right. Has anybody got anything else for Ken? No? Okay. All right. Paul, is this next one yours? It looks as if it's got your name on it. Even though it says so on the agenda.
Chair, you okay if I give a brief overview, then be guided by questions after that? Reporting on the month ending December 2015, the most significant incident or events reported are the floods which hit North Yorkshire, affected many people, many communities, none more so than York, Selby and Tadcaster. And a number of us in the room performed the role of strategic and tactical commanders. Richard performed the role as tactical commander for a couple of days and met the Prime Minister as well. Ken was the principal gold commander, and myself and Mr Madgwick also performed the role of gold as well. But also in response to the floods, we're also dealing with a number of crime operations as well, the number of burglaries and thefts that took place as well, and those investigations are still ongoing. I don't know, Ken, whether you want to make any further mention of the floods?
Only that we've had our internal debrief last Monday and our debrief with partners yesterday, and so we'll be collecting all the learning from that and then sharing it with you once we've had the ability to put it all in one place.
Okay,
sorry, I was just in terms of it as a goal for those of us that did it and for the silver, it was probably the most challenging set of circumstances that I think I've had to deal with in that position, because of the volume of things that were changing. We joke about when we train. We do tabletop exercises, and a tabletop exercise where you sit around with partners and you get a paper feed which gives you a scenario, and the scenario gets progressively worse during the day. This would have been your worst nightmare tabletop exercise, and that was reflected across partners. It was particularly challenging this time.
In essence, I think we were dealing with two major incidents, the same major incident. One was obviously the flooding and the impact it had on the communities and businesses, far wider than just North Yorkshire, because the business impact in West Yorkshire had significant, and the other one was a major failure in relation to communications. And the one thing you don't want in any critical instance is a loss of your communications network, and we had it in all sorts of different areas, all at the same time. So I think I'd echo what Ken said, but also I pay particular credit to those people. I know there's been criticism in the media and other places. There's been a lot of thanks as well, but to those people who were the first responders, who did the evacuation and had to work with minimal notice, and actually had to go and do the really difficult stuff, which was try and persuade people to leave their homes when they were working in conditions that were sometimes far from safe, but far from ideal. And they were the people who I think who deserved credit, and then the people who carried on over the next couple of days, because there was individual stories of members of staff who got flooded who continued to come to work and then sorted out their flooded home. So they did the 12 hours, then went back to sort out their homes. Things like that, which sometimes you should never take for granted. I think.
Just on the burglaries that were reported around the flooding, can you just provide some context around, my understanding there were 6 houses out of a total of 600 homes evacuated, and we have somebody in custody for all 6 of those offences?
We do. That person's currently on bail and the investigation is ongoing.
And that was somebody who was a North Yorkshire resident?
Yes.
Ken, you mentioned that there was going to be a debrief with partners.
We had a debrief with partners yesterday.
Right. Okay. So presumably they were operational partners.
Yes.
Yes. So I'm just. There was obviously a whole range of other stakeholders involved in all of this who had a big interest in it. Is there going to be some sort of, not necessarily debrief, but communication around them, or are we just going to deal with questions asked and when they arise, if you see what I mean?
I think
there's 2 things. One is that obviously within the North Yorkshire Chief Execs and City of York, there's a kind of a lessons learned gold group that Nigel Hutchison, I think, chairs. And secondly, we are aware that there is going to be some form of inquiry through the City of York.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of anything beyond the City of York currently, unless you are.
No, the multi-agency debrief we had with all those agencies that are involved, when the police have a responsibility for managing the rescue attempts, for want of a better phrase, until such time as we get to a state of recovery, in which case we hand over to the County Council. And the sort of partners who are involved in that are military, their Environment Agency, Met Office, all the utilities, etc. So it was those that we had the debrief for yesterday. So our focus will be on on the response. Did we achieve the strategy, which is based around saving life, and nobody lost their lives? Although a lot of people suffered, obviously the loss of property, etc. So did we achieve the strategy? What are the lessons learned for us approaching future events? That's the police's role. The broader public role is a matter for the local authority, and they should be dealing with that.
Okay, so I'm interested, for example, in some of the resilience issues to do with the communications, and there's various contracts up at the moment that there's been previous issues with the resilience in difficult circumstances with particular suppliers, and I'm just wondering how any of those type of issues that are things that were experienced on a local level might get filtered up to a national level where things could be looked at. So I'm thinking particularly around the procurement that's going through at the moment for the 111101 number.
Yeah.
So is there a way that will get escalated? Because I was at the last national meeting on that. There's another one coming up, and I think some of the issues that we discussed at that national meeting are pertinent for the way in which that contract needs to be looked at.
I think in the immediacy, those issues were raised through the various goal commanders through COBRA, which is obviously the Cabinet Office review, and actually part of our debrief is then to make sure that whatever lessons are learned we then feed to the appropriate agencies. I mean, one of them is around a particular BT exchange, which meant we lost the 101.
Yeah.
And we just need to separate whether or not was it an issue with 101 or the BT exchange.
Well, I think there's an issue. So I think there's issues for the region about the big companies in relation to not just in North Yorkshire but West Yorkshire as well, because that was the biggest impact that we had to start with. And you're right. I think then as part of the contract, it's what the contingency plans are to deal with, and that's the thing that I think is the biggest challenge. I mean, we can all debate what unprecedented rainfall, but you would expect of really large organisations to have good contingency plans. And one of the things that I think as Gold Commanders we experienced was trying to understand where was the contingency plan and how effective was the contingency plan. There'll be a mixture of answers to that, so I'm not saying one was good and one was bad, but it was a question that was continually asked, and I think needs to be picked up as in a coordinated way so those themes aren't lost, because the Chief said BT was a particular issue in York, we know Vodafone was a particular issue in Leeds, and then there's an issue, I think, in understanding the strategic vulnerability of a modern communication network and what the understanding is of that, and if you understand that, you understand the threat and risk and how you're trying to protect it, because that could have also led to loss of life ultimately if it had gone a particular way. It didn't positively, but.
So from an operational point of view, Simon Cole is leading on that 101, and I'm just wondering perhaps then if we make sure that debrief or report gets to Simon and he can pick up anything that comes out of it, because I'm not hugely confident that the Cabinet Office might join up the dots.
I couldn't possibly comment. But the other issue is that Charlie Hall is also the lead for civil contingencies, who actually sits on all the governmental agencies, and when we have major incidents like this, the lessons learned also go through there as well. Right, so we probably picked it as sort of a multi-dimensional attack, really.
Okay. Yeah, I think I can pick it up through some national groups into the procurement aspect as well, to make sure that at the first point of actually new contracts coming through that we're cited on it, because I'm not sure how robust that has been, and with the contracts migrating over from the Home Office into the ICT company, there's a real opportunity there, and there's probably the prevalent one for us which we're very mindful on, which is the replacement for the airwaves. We've already flagged up that we've got concerns about coverage and to ensure coverage. Again, any reports that we've got that highlighted some of the actual practical issues we've got, if they're shared, we can use them on a number of through different forums.
But again, I was just going to say, as this is in one sense a public meeting, because they're listening, I think the important thing when the Force Control Room staff then did the review afterwards, there were very, very few calls, despite all the problems they had, and they were huge, and some of them completely out of their control. The contingency plans they put in meant that literally only a couple of calls were missed, and that in the scale of not having access to some systems for hours is, they worked incredibly hard, as did the staff who were then supporting the Force Control Room, to make sure that the public were served appropriately, even though we recognised it wasn't what we would have hoped to be because of the technological issues. So I think it's worth reiterating that, because some people may think we missed hundreds and hundreds of calls. Far from it, we didn't do that. We did have some obviously changeable demand and changeable issues, but they put in all sorts of systems to try and make sure we didn't miss the most critical.
And just to reassure, I know that through both when Richard and I were there with the Prime Minister, these issues were raised directly with the Prime Minister and raised by the Gold Commanders with Cobra to get an immediate response from those companies. I think it's the lessons learned now, which is how we protect the infrastructure in the nation, particularly BT exchanges and sort of substations, all of which can be very vulnerable to flooding in particular, and understanding which premises are at risk and also what flows beneath and above North Yorkshire from a critical infrastructure point of view, which was linked to some of the issues we had around Tadcaster Bridge.
I think there's a couple of other things just to finish the points off. That at the multi-agency debrief, the issue with utilities is picked up under the North Yorkshire Local Resilience Forum. We call that NILERF for ease, but North Yorkshire Local Resilience Forum, they have a utilities subgroup that reports into that. That utilities subgroup was represented, well, the utilities represented, but the direction that I gave as chair of the debrief was that group was to meet to discuss and understand the issues that resulted in that. So, for example, I mentioned the 101 service, the BT person that was there said that wasn't related to the BT Stonebow. So we need to understand what was it related to. Then once we understand what it was related to, then we can address that. In terms of feeding that back into the national picture, I'm the number 2 region, so that's the 7 forces that sit within our region, the Yorkshires, Humber, Northumbria, Durham and Cleveland. I'm the number 2 region lead for civil contingencies, and I'll feed into Charlie Hall, the national lead. And also sat in our debrief was DCLG, Department for Communities Local Government. They sat on our multi-agency debrief. They gave us their input from government in terms of what they felt lessons learned locally, and we fed back to them to back up to government in terms of what we felt, and they go to all the multi-agency debriefs. So there's a number of links in there. The most important one for us, I think, will be the understanding the specific lessons to be learned, and then applying that through our local resilience forum going forward, and changing our response plans. Part of that will be understanding what the specific issues of the utilities was, and then we can report that back in.
Was it agreed that there would be a follow-up meeting where agencies involved in York and North Yorkshire were going to update what they've done against the progress of the issues raised?
Yeah, absolutely there was, and that's to be dealt with by the North Yorkshire Local Resilience Forum. That's their role, and so it'll be taken forward by them.
I'm not sure that's the
It's an old detective trick, that, Paul.
That's better.
I did it.
The only other thing is we're not, unless because Ken's still leading as gold for the sort of post-event consequences. If we've heard from the City of York around that sort of inquiry, for want of an expression, that they're going to conduct.
No, I haven't seen the terms of reference yet, and I don't know the timescales. It might exist. I just haven't seen it yet. There was the public meeting last week where we were represented. Which was, in fairness, a difficult meeting because you expect the public to be challenging this thing quite rightly, and us held to account amongst others, and that was done. And so there's still work to go on. My focus has been on understanding the timeline of activity. So what do we know when? At the moment, we've taken it back to the Boxing Day, and what we knew from we've taken that from 8 AM on Boxing Day right the way through to handing over, and we've got a specific timeline for all of the activity and decisions made. What the DCLG, Department of Communities Local Government, invited us to look at is what we knew from Christmas Eve, because there was some other, what was the Met Office saying and things like that. So we're just taking the timeline back a bit to see if we could have stepped up infrastructure before then, or should have. We don't think we do, but we just want to have a double check on that. So that's the only other activity that's taken place, and then we'll be in a position to do a final report.
Okay, fantastic. John, is there, given that fact, no, okay, all right.
So just touching on wider performance briefly, Chair, if I can. Crime has increased by 6.9% for the 9 months leading up to the end of December compared to the 9 months in 2014. Antisocial behaviour is decreased by 6.6%, and as I reported in previous meetings, it still means that North Yorkshire is the safest county in England. Crime levels have gone up in most of the forces, both nationally and in the region. I've also reported in the past that there are other factors other than crime trends that lead to that increase in crime. An example of that latter point is violence without injury. That's one of the crime categories which you can see from the performance pack has seen an increase. And one of the major crime types which contribute to that is the offence of harassment, which I just wanted to touch upon briefly if I can. Harassment, there are a number of subcategories, and I won't try and address all of them, but there's quite an extensive list which includes things like breach of restraining order, breach of conditions of injunction, disclosure of private sexual photographs, harassment, stalking offences, and so on. The reason I mention that is that we have seen a significant increase. So in the year end in April, so the year end in March 2014, there were 310 of those offences, 310 offences of harassment. So far this year, 9 months into this year, there's been 724. In the last 12 months leading up to April last year, there were 502. So you can see quite an exponential increase in the offence of harassment, which I believe is more down to the recording of harassment rather than the actual increase in offences. And we also know that 45% of harassment cases are non-domestic related, 55% are domestic related. So we are seeing an increase in domestic related harassment as well.
Paul, can you just for the sake, because I think domestic, that could be interpreted in different ways. That's in relation to domestic abuse.
It is, yes.
Yes, yeah, as opposed to people arguing with one another. Domestic,
yes.
You know what I mean? Yes.
Yeah, so I shorten the phrase to domestic abuse is what to refer to. So, but we are seeing an increase in harassment, both of domestic abuse related and those not related to domestic abuse. In terms of proactivity, operations have continued. We touched upon ANPR previously.
Sorry, Paul, if you're moving on, sorry, I just want to pick up on this issue of harassment then. Because I agree there is the increase is there. The other thing that I suppose I would like the force to explore is this whole issue around when something is civil and when somebody's behaviour becomes harassing as a consequence of a civil argument. And we get quite a lot of, I know they're very difficult, these cases, but we get quite a lot of people coming into my surgeries in these circumstances, and we've had 3 in the last set of surgeries that I've got. And very often the root cause of the problem is a civil dispute, but the behaviour escalates and then becomes something else altogether. And sometimes the concern expressed by members of the public is that they feel that they are being dealt with as a civil case, and that the behaviour of the individuals involved is not being seen appropriately. And and we get a lot of this type of thing, don't we, Will? And I'm just wondering whether there's an opportunity to look at some of the cases that we've had come in, you know, anonymised if needs be, to look at the circumstances in that, to explore some of this, because I think it would be helpful.
I think, in a nutshell, some people, like victims, I suppose, feel like their case is tagged as civil, and therefore it sort of hits a brick wall every time they resend some other information in, or, you know, that something different has happened. They feel like, but we told you it was civil, we've looked at it, and that's
so
it. That might not be the case, but that's how they feel it's being perceived.
And so it's very often in relation to cases where people are deploying CCTV cameras, you know, shining them into people's living rooms, those sort of things. So the actual sort of tactics that people are using to promote their argument, if you see what I mean, as opposed to deal with the root causes of the argument, which might be civil.
It tend to be neighbour disputes as well.
Yes, yeah. And they often involve multiple people.
A couple of points, if I may.
Yeah.
Our aspiration is to meet the needs of the victim, whatever the circumstances are, making sure that we're meeting the expectations. Speaking for myself, throughout my police service, that dispute has always been there between what's civil and what's criminal, and there's always a difficulty to understand, particularly from a victim's point of view. But what we have more recently is the availability of civil orders to assist us in enforcement. So, for example, in the case of harassment, we've got to prove a course of conduct whereby somebody offends more than twice and so many times. We now use harassment information notices, so we can serve a notice on an offender, which is not a criminal notice, it's not legally binding, but it could assist in future prosecution as well. So, as of recently, the figure, if you remember, at the end of last year was around about 250 harassment information notices were in place within North Yorkshire. So we're using those civil powers to protect people and keep them safe. And there's a growing number of civil orders which are available, particularly to protect vulnerable people as well. So the police are exploiting those civil orders as much as possible. It is creating a demand within our legal department, because they've got a role to play there as well. But it's one of a number of tools we can use to protect people when there's no clear criminal offence, but those civil orders can be used to protect them.
I think we've also looked from a professional standards perspective, because a number of complaints we get relate to harassment. It's very clear, if the matter is criminal, then it's our responsibility. I think that I have some sympathy sometimes with the officers, because sometimes they get both portrayed to be victims and both portrayed to be offenders, and it's and then getting some independent evidence when they're both doing that is a difficult scenario. Clearly, they're aware of some tactics that people use, but through Maria Taylor and her predecessor, we did look at the volume of complaints linked to harassment and try to tease out anything we could and look at best practice in terms of ways of avoiding that. Well, obviously, the ways of trying to actually present the evidence and facts that are available. But it's sometimes I think the officer, to all the members of the staff, discusses being in the middle of a situation where allegations are being put to and fro. That's not a defence where we don't deliver the service. It's just an explanation sometimes of where people find themselves.
Yeah, I mean, they're very difficult and very complicated, and things can escalate on either side, and so it's very difficult sometimes to tell who's, you know. I understand that, but I just think we had a discussion about hins and hins at the last meeting, and I just think this is an area that partly because we've got an increase, so we've seen an increase here, and I'm wondering whether some of the increases that I'm seeing in my surgeries is reflected of that general increase. I don't know, but I think it's an area that I think we need a bit more scrutiny around, and perhaps some of the learning from the professional standards stuff could be integrated into a sort of wider look at how these are dealt with.
I'll speak and I'll review a cross section of ones we've had recently and just come up with a sort of a brief.
It'd be useful to know kind of if you can provide the anonymised, if people are willing to provide that anonymised information and look at the case studies, because often some of the case studies is if you have lots of officers involved, it usually doesn't go well. as opposed to having a nominated officer who understands the full history.
Completely.
And it goes back to the point we're making around Thrive, which is if you don't understand the full history, often you might not get that vulnerability quite right. And also, if you've got a neighbourhood officer who's been dealing with this dispute for a while, they do start tapping into the wider expertise of the organisation as well to deal with it. There's just been really careful around us stepping into the civil world when we actually haven't got the powers to do that.
Yeah.
We need to maximise as well, that means sort of community remedy disposals. And
Well, we do look at the whole sort of community trigger stuff on some of these as well, so that's all sort of brings into it. But there's a growth in reports, and there's a growth in tools that the police have got to deal with these, and I just wonder where it's an opportune time to actually sort of take a review and have a look at them.
I also wonder if it'll be case by case on an officer basis. It might be the way they're told it's a civil matter, essentially, as well. That might not help.
Well, I mean, we had an incident recently where somebody was told that they were to stop calling 101 because it was a civil matter, and now I think people should call 101 if they've got a concern, whether it's civil or not, really, just in case. Anyway.
Well, the review. We'll look at the cases. There may be issues there because, of course, things like legal aid in terms of certain situations where it's not an opportunity for people to pursue or self-fund. There are other opportunities. But let's have a look at the evidence and see what that takes us.
So just briefly then, Chair, proactive operations continue with the roads crime team from the 1st of July to the end of 2015, arrested 220 people for travelling crime. Many of those arrests linked to the use of ANPR. Within the information pack that's been circulated prior to this meeting, there's a number of major crime operations just to reflect some of the work carried out by the major crime team, and obviously a huge amount of work carried out by the serious crime teams as well regarding serious sexual offences and offences of rape and domestic abuse. Final point to make is in relation to Operation Attention, which was the drink driving operation that took place during the course of December. 2014, a year ago, there were 103 arrests. In December 2015, there were 124, so we've seen an increase in arrests as part of that operation. In York there were 28 arrests, Scarborough 24, Harrogate there were 16. Craven was relatively quite high, there was 13 arrests for drunk driving during the course of December.
Could I just ask quickly, obviously we've got new equipment now around the drug testing.
Yes.
What proportion, how does that split down?
The biggest increase was in drug driving,
right,
and our ability. We presented some offenders to court several times through that campaign. But actually proportionally, when you compare it to some of our much bigger neighbours, our activity on the roads to try and make them safer during that period or the outcomes in relation to court appearances far greater. So either we've got a bigger problem or we spent more time trying to track and deal with the offenders. It depends which way you read that.
So that increase, could some of that be down to the fact that we're now doing the drugs testing?
Some of it is.
Right.
Some of the proportion is, yes, that we've got, because it's largely road policing specialists, although not completely road policing specialists, but it's road policing specialists who do the drug interventions, and they saw an increase of probably 17 over the previous year because they didn't have the equipment and the technology and the law to do it. What I would say, just briefly, I know the ACC skipped over it, but it is pleasing to see that we've seen continual reductions in the killed and serious injured area, which I know is one of the priorities, and they are significant against the national figures. So it's, I don't know, it's sometimes we see it on the national charts.
I wasn't aware that very last point. You stole my thunder.
Is that it? Okay, so to note the KSI casualties, it's good news considering we've had high rates.
It is. We were starting from a position where unfortunately we had a higher level of KSIs, and as you know, some of our rural roads are potentially difficult. So any reduction, but to see some marked reductions, and obviously hopefully linked to ongoing work in those areas. We wanted, obviously any deaths are too many, but there's still over 30 people lost their lives in the last calendar year, which is a huge number.
Okay, just conscious of time, there's nothing else that anybody wants to pick up from this? No? Okay, so we're on to item 8. which is exceptions against the delivery strands. I think it would be fair to say this is the area that we've been having a discussion about how we improve this part of the agenda. So perhaps the next one we can take that forward.
Okay, well, we're proposing to do that from April because
From
we've got
April,
the,
right.
yeah, from April with the new board planner
Fine,
and the new
okay, all right,
agenda items,
okay.
if that's all right.
Right. Okay. So I think we've done vulnerable people, haven't we? Paul? Unless there's anything else.
We have. The action is understand it was to give a verbal update on CSC, but also understand there's an action for a written report on child sexual exploitation to come next month. So I can give a verbal overview if you wish, or defer it to a written report next month.
Yeah. Early intervention and prevention.
No exceptions.
Improve victim care.
No exceptions. Unless you want to pick up the press release.
Yes, I was going to say.
Yeah.
I think that's an exception.
Yeah.
All right.
So, do you want me to say a couple of words? So, at the moment, we're currently working towards an April the 1st deadline to take a proportion of supporting victims, our services to support victims after crime, in-house. So currently the contract is with Victim Support to do the central needs assessment and referral to support services, and that is the proportion that we will be taking in-house. So that will be a team that sits under commissioning and partnerships who will deliver for every victim of crime a needs assessment and a referral into support services. The services we already have available in the community and in effect that we refer on to, they will stay with the current providers. So Victim Support will still run the community outreach service and they'll still run our independent victim advisor service as well.
Okay. Okay, and then there's the...
Well, there's the whole issue of paediatrics
Yes,
as well,
George.
which is, I know and you've been working very hard in trying to ensure that victims of some of the most serious sexual offences are given the appropriate level of service. And I think it's fair to say we are unhappy about the position at the moment, and we'll work hard over the next couple of months to ensure we rectify that situation, because it cannot be right that some of our most vulnerable victims have to travel sometimes up to 2 hours north or 2 hours west to get the level of support they need. And actually, you in the role as Commissioner trying to ensure that we deliver good value for money in terms of the services we either commission or we try and source. And it is an area of frustration that I know we've got to rectify.
Okay, thank you.
I would just like to acknowledge, if you don't mind, that we have progressed quite significantly. We've still got a long way to go, but we have moved forward over the last year. So there is a lot of work being done with partners to make sure that we progress in that direction.
No, it's not easy, and some of the things are definitely not local issues, and are far wider than that. And I think it's difficult trying to deliver a local service when you've got those type of issues to contend with. So, yeah, okay, all right.
Could I also just mention, from a vulnerable person's perspective, the force control room triage that we've now got up and running? So we were hoping to have that up and running pre-Christmas, but unfortunately due to staffing issues within the health sector, we weren't able to start it until mid-January. But we've now got a 12-hour weekend service running within the force control room, where we have a mental health nurse working within force control room for 12 hours, Thursday, Friday, Saturday and Sunday, 10 till 10, to support those people calling for service, to have the best response possible from our officers, so to give advice and guidance about how best to deal with issues. So again, not ideal, because we were hoping to have a 7-day-a-week service, but we're progressing towards that forward.
Okay, all right, so we'll pick up the detail of that elsewhere as we look ahead for the next sort of budget period.
That also clearly links into the Thrive assessment and the conversation and the requirements, doesn't it?
Yeah, and could significantly assist. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting, even in the news today when we talk about demand around mental health, that I think it's Norman Lamb, who's through a Freedom of Information request has seen the level of serious, there's obviously serious deaths in relation to mental health, and then serious incidents related to mental health go up significantly. I was talking about 30% increases in the last couple of years. They're national figures based on the FOI, and I think we just see our proportion of that based in North Yorkshire. I don't think we're any different from the national picture, but it is putting additional power. So the work we're doing around mental health, I think, is there's been some real excellent progress, but it's critical that we maintain that momentum.
Thank you. So next one is transforming the organisation.
Nothing from a collaboration perspective.
People first, we've just done. And partnerships and commissioning, we've just talked about. Yeah. Affordability.
Yes, prior to Christmas we reported that the Chancellor announced that the police budget was going to be protected, and we said that the Chief Finance Officers for both the Commissioner and the Chief Constable were going to go away and work on the information that came through from the Chancellor in terms of what that actually means for North Yorkshire. Work's been ongoing with that information, and in real terms that translates into a 1.3% cut over a 4-year period. But the government's further advised that we should plan on the basis of the referendum limit for the police precept to be maintained at the 2% figure that had been in place before, and that's for the next spending review period. And so therefore, if we chose to freeze the precept on that basis, that would actually mean a cut in the overall funding. You conducted a survey, Commissioner, recently asking the public of North Yorkshire whether or not they'd be in favour of retaining the precept at the current level, or whether they'd be in favour of it being raised or reduced, and they were generally in favour of it being maintained at the current level. That proposal is going to be submitted to the Police and Crime Plan next week, and on the basis of those discussions, the outcome of that will be factored into the medium-term financial plan, and that'll go through for agreement at next month's Executive Board.
Thank you very much. Just to be clear that it's my decision, rather than us. Okay. Anything? Have we had anything come through? Anything else on any of those? That concludes item 8. No. Anything? No. Okay. All right. Any other business anybody would like to raise? Nope. Date of next meeting we've got to look at because of various national responsibilities that we have, so we're going to come back to people on that. So that's this part of the meeting concluded. We've just got one element to consider in part 2, I think.